I want to thank the committee for inviting me here to participate. I believe it is an honor and a privilege to address this wide, diverse body of African people from all over the country and perhaps outside the country. First thing I want to do is call upon the memory of one of the great geniuses of black music, Rahsaan Roland Kirk. Rahsaan performed a piece which he wrote entitled "Blackness" some years ago. I have a interpretation of what that meant to me, and I want to share this little poem that I wrote to some classical black music. Blackness, B-L-A-C-K-N-U-S-S. Blackness, B-L-A-C-K-N-U-S-S. Blackness, B-L-A-C-K-N-U-S-S. Blackness was the beginning. Blackness shall be the ending. Blackness is between reality and a dream. Blackness appears when the sun disappears from view. Blackness is where we descend for our minds and spirits to renew. Can you remember the blackness of the womb? Do you know that you were a flower getting ready to bloom? Descend, rise, descend, rise, descend, rise, 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 rise in blackness. Thank you. My presentation is going to be kind of interesting, and I'm looking forward. I hope I get your indulgence because no one hasn't heard this before, except a few close friends of mine. One, Dr. Carl Spite, many of you may know. We've gone back and forth over this, and he even told me that it's one of the most exciting things that he's heard, especially since one of his professors was one of the persons who introduced the term Soliton some years ago, and he was thought as, still is, as someone way out in the netherworld of science. So what I'm going to present to you, I haven't done this publicly, so I want you to understand that this is a metaphor, and metaphors are organizing principles to get us to understand ourselves at deeper and deeper levels. All physical theory is nothing but metaphor. When you get down to the nitty-gritty, that's all it is an attempt to describe our environment. Whether you're talking about charge of an electron or some mathematical principle, even a psychological principle, even religion and myth. All of those are metaphors to organize how we interact with ourselves, each other, and the environment. So in that sense, that's what I'm presenting here. And with the hope that it can help fine-tune a lot of our assumptions that we have, because we come up in a society that is not conducive to our way of living, of thinking, of behaving. So with that, I just want to introduce to you, what this is, because sometimes it gets a little esoteric. In fact, it would be a major epistemic break with contemporary Cartesian Western science way of looking at reality. Many people, including many theologians, will have problems with what I have to say. Notwithstanding, many scientists will have problems with what I have to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. So just bear with me. First, I'm going to start. First slide, please. Giving you some information about melanin that is very hard to find in the literature. These are special properties of melanin. We heard a lot about the chemical nature, but there's some other things about melanin that really makes it a very unique molecule, organizing molecule to be more specific. The first thing, it is a two-section paracrystalline polymer. What does that mean? That a crystal, such as quartz or salt, has a regular ordered pattern. But melanin is amorphous, that it has a disordered pattern, but that disorder makes for its uniqueness. Okay, now I want you to understand that I'm going to introduce some words that we normally have a negative connotation of, such as disorder. You know, Rosalind talked about, when she talked about Legba, you know, the function of disorder. You look at Kemetic life ways, you see Set. You know, he represents disorder, but for a purpose. So disorder is very important towards the evolution and elevation of our own consciousness. Because within disorder you find what? Order. But we have to focus our attentions on that order within the disorder. Do y'all understand that? Does that make any sense? So, I need someone to open that up. So, melanin, with its two-tiered structure, has an optical absorption spectrum that is constant from the near-infrared to 400 nanometers, which is getting down in the blue range. But then it dramatically rises in efficiency in the ultraviolet range. One part of the planar stacks are tuned to absorb the visible spectrum, and its core is tuned to absorb ultraviolet light and high-energy alpha rays, beta rays, and gamma rays. Okay, so it's tuned to absorb and later we'll see transform these different forms of electromagnetic energy. Melanin, from X-ray diffraction studies, we find that it contains many different metal ions. An ion is simply an atom minus the electrons, such as, as far as melanin's case, zinc, copper, iron, and a whole host of others. Furthermore, melanin exhibits ultra-weak chemical and photo-induced chemical luminescence. Now, what does that mean? That simply means that when a light particle strikes a melanin molecule, it generates an electron, which in turn generates light itself, or sound, called phonons. Even when the melanin molecule is destroyed, it is still capable of protecting the cell. And one of the things that Dr. McGee, in his brochure anyway, he mentioned that it's so stable, is it God? Well, we're going to come to that a little later on about the significance of its stability. Melanin has a thermal activation energy of from 0.93 to 0.104 electron volts. Now that's a very small amount of energy it takes to cause a reaction. Very, very small. And I'm going to show you the significance of that in a few minutes. Melanin is super paramagnetic. Okay, we're all familiar with magnetism. We've all had experience with magnets. You put the north poles together and they'll fly apart. You put north and south and they'll come together. Well, that's called ferromagnetism, which simply means that two structures, two elements that have a certain order will tend to come together. Okay? Then you have the opposite called diamagnetism, which means two other elements will tend to push themselves apart. Then you have paramagnetism, which simply means that there is a small affinity between two different elements. Okay, a small affinity. Then you have superparamagnetism, which simply means that the affinity for attraction is close to, but not the same intensity as something that's ferromagnetic. So that's very significant in the fact that of those magnetic qualities. Melanin is an energy converter, photon, electron, phonon transformation, and back. But also, melanin is insoluble to ordinary solvents. In fact, the true structure of that molecule still remains unknown. Even with X-ray diffraction and a whole lot of other spectrographic techniques, the true structure is unknown. Perhaps with some high-energy neutron diffraction studies, we may get a chance to pierce that darkness to see what the light looks like. We will probably find that there are some other important elements which gives it this structure which recently they're calling a superatom state. And that simply means that we're talking about mesoscopic particles. Now, what does that mean? Well, you have micro, which means something very small. You have macro, which means something that's very large. And then you have everything in between, which is called meso. So atoms themselves are micro and other subatomic particles. Molecules are macro, and everything that you can see larger than a molecule is macro, that you can visibly see. You can't visibly see an electron, you can only see the absence of it. But then you have this center thing that they call mesoscopic materials. And these objects, and I'm going to read this is from Science News, November 1986. A Japanese physicist said that it should be possible to synthetically make such a structure as a super atom. That is, a molecule that is so stable that it takes on the form of a natural element, like oxygen or iron, okay, that they said they can create a molecule that has the same stability, okay? And now we're going to see how melanin fits in this equation, I think anyway. Okay, it says, one such possibility is the superatom, a structure made of semiconductor materials that behaves as if it was a giant atom. Okay, when we look at melanin, we find that because of its amorphous structure and because it has many different metals, that it acts like it acts as a semiconductor. Okay? That it can change its conductivity state depending upon the input of energy. And that's a semiconductor is nothing but the technical term for a transistor. And that simply means that you can have a structure. Quickly draw this. You have something, I'll just draw a box. This is input here. This is out. And then this is control. Okay. This is control point. And so you want energy to come through, but if you have a lot coming through, you want to have some way to prevent all this to come through. And so you can put a control voltage and it will only let a certain amount come through this material because the conductivity of it changes. That you can control the conductivity. That's all a transistor is. Okay, it's nothing mystical or magical about transistors. You know, we deal with them every day with our Walkmans and TVs, so forth and so on. So that's all a semiconductor is. But one of the problems with the transfer of energy is that you have heat dissipated. Okay, that's one of the problems. So they found that there's certain materials that you can make, certain combinations of different metals that you can make. When you cool them down to a minus 459.4 degrees Fahrenheit, they lose all their resistance and electricity will flow through them. Electrons will flow and not generate heat. Okay, that's called a superconductor, in that it conducts electricity and no heat is generated, so it's very efficient. But the irony is it's very cost ineffective because you have to continuously supply liquid helium. And liquid helium is expensive because you have to condense helium gas down to a liquid state, and you have to go through a whole lot of process, and so it's just cost ineffective. And because of the way Western science looks at things, they had a psychological barrier that nothing could be made superconducting above that temperature, less known room temperature or body temperature. But in 1972, in a journal called Physiological Chemistry and Physics, a naval engineer, Freeman Cope, suggested that melanin is a natural organic superconductor because of how efficiently it transduces energy from one form to another form. And now they have made several materials that are organic. They synthesized some organic materials that are superconducting, but the problem is they're superconducting at extremely low temperatures. Recently, the psychological barrier that Western science puts on things was destroyed when some Japanese, seems like the Japanese are really moving in this, developed some materials that superconduct at liquid nitrogen temperatures, which is about 167 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 167 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, melanin is a superconductor. Because of its structure, it's also a superatom because it's so stable. It can't be, it's very difficult to destroy it completely, to pierce through its structure. So, melanin is an organic, superconducting superatom. Now that's deep, because that speaks to why it's been so important for life on Earth, and why at some point it's been identified that there are many organic molecules in the dust clouds of interstellar space. In fact, I just found out just this past week that some white scientists, now I don't know how they did this, but I'm not offending anyone, but I don't know how they did this, but they stole some of the cobblestone in Mecca. That's right. They stole some of the cobblestone in Mecca. You talk about a violation, that's absolutely unreal. But what did they do with it? They took it back to the lab and analyzed. This was in the late 1800s, and I have the paper if anyone wants to look at it after the lecture. They took it back to the lab, and what did they find? They found life in there. They found bacteria. They found amino acids present in the meteorite. They found viruses in meteorites from all over the world. Now, my lecture today is on solitons and melanin. I'm not going to talk about that because that's a whole other thing. But anyway, it raised a whole lot of issues that African people have had for a long time, that life comes down And now we know that the Earth has been inundated with micro icy comets, and that's how the waters of the oceans formed, the waters of the Nile River formed, which they in fact say. So melanin has a whole host of different properties. The last one is that it is extremely stable. It acts like a soliton. I'm going to explain that in a few minutes. Next slide, please. This represents a rain of information. Every day we have to deal with this. Information comes to us, and that cloud is representing the metaconscious. Now, what does that word mean? We've heard unconscious, subconscious, superconscious, non-conscious. You know, yeah, it's really strange, something that's non-conscious. That's just totally out of the ordinary. Something that's non-conscious, but metaconscious is a bit more specific. And one of the things that's coming out of this conference, which I really like, are terms that are a bit more specific, where we all, based on whatever our level of training, whatever our religious persuasion is, we can understand one another and not get into an extended dialogue that could be counterproductive. So we're coming up with very specific terms to describe things. And metaconscious is such a term. That simply means everything that's conscious. I mean, the total realm of consciousness states that a human being experiences. Conscious simply means the particular state that a person happens to be in at any given moment. That means where your attention is focused. And so we see that we are being just like being in a monsoon of information. We have no idea of how much information that we take in, compress, translate, stored to be used at a later date. So with that, we have to give some definition to what reality, consciousness, information is. We have to first understand that reality is a product of the dialogue between human consciousness and the physical environment, which is that whole metaconscious thing. It's a holistic process, and the vocabulary for understanding this relationship is information. And information is on many different levels. Consciousness, human consciousness, can insert information into the environment as well as extract information out of it. Okay? What I mean by consciousness is all categories of human experiencing processing, including perception, cognition, intuition, instinct, emotion, at all levels. And I'm using that as an unbounded term. I'm not going to get hung up in any current Western psychological literature definition for consciousness. Environment is the metaconscious, or all circumstances influencing, surrounding the consciousness, which it perceives, that's very important, to be separate from it. In this way, environment comprises a multi-dimensional hierarchy of contexts within which consciousness may function, beginning with its own physical corpus and extending successively to its physical environment, to all other consciousness, and finally to remote influences that in any way may condition its experiences. Information is all physical, intellectual, and emotional currency, or even including nomenclature, that has a capacity to specify or quantify the state of one's consciousness or the environment. And all this is not new. You know, I didn't give you anything that's new because our ancestors have laid all this out before us. So nothing here I gave is new. Now, Next slide, please. You can just deal with the top part first, it's fine. Okay. This is just going to focus in on just one aspect. There's been some recent studies that found some profound similarities between the retina of the eye and the pineal gland. In fact, the structures of them are very, very similar. We see that there's a neural pathway from the retina to the pineal, passes through a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. And this in turn generates the melatonin rhythm, this whole transduction from the eye to the pineal gland through that certain part of the brain. You can move that up now. Well, we're going to have to accelerate quite rapidly here. This bottom part is showing the melatonin rhythm. Can you move that up a little bit more? The top part is in the winter, and we see during the winter months when there's less light, there's more melatonin within the blood. And the bottom, during the summer, when you have long days, you have less melatonin. This peaks at around 4 a.m. in the morning. Next slide. Okay, this is just showing different types of activity of our nervous system. You have the first one, which is called noise, which is simply uncorrelated firing of neurons. The second, you have coherent waves, like alpha waves, beta waves, that's present in meditation, consciousness states, dream states. Then you have spikes or pulses, which are indicative of certain types of dysfunctions, like epilepsy. And then you have the bottom, which is labeled chaos, and that's normal brain function. Now, I told you, I'm dealing a thing here on terms. That simply means that within all of this, that's showing you the integration of all the things that's taking place within us simultaneously at every given moment of any time. But we only focus on a very small part of that seemingly chaos to pick out the order. Next slide. Okay, you can just that right there, that's fine. Just move that part up. Okay, this is showing you cell structure and how information is transferred. You see there's some little things, those, I don't have a pointer, but where that arrow is pointing at where it says glycoproteins, can everyone see that? Okay, and then you have some little lines that look like spines coming up. Well, those assemblies are highly charged ions, and they form an ion antenna. And they're specific for each individual organ. Each organ has its own resonant frequency or signature. Every protein, in fact, acts as a tiny magnet, moving by magnetic motion. Where's Malachi? Magnetic motion. Furthermore, their movement is reflective of the movement of the sun, moon, planets, and stars. Thus, at birth, every living thing has a celestial serial number, or frequency power spectrum. You know, this is the basis for astrology right here. The next slide. Show the top part first. Okay, well that's fine. Okay, this is a representation of wave motion. And now I'm going to explain to you somewhat of what the stability of the melanin molecule means. And it has to do with a state called the Soliton state, Soliton waves. I don't have time to go into a whole lot of details, but Albert Einstein said that the most beautiful experience of a man is that of mystery. This is the feeling that gives birth to true art and science. Well, for me, Soliton waves evoke that feeling because, unlike anything else known in nature, they are not inherently physical matter or energy. I want to repeat that. Soliton waves are not inherently physical matter nor energy. Soliton waves are transphysical, phase-space resonant functions, more specifically, the formable, deformable space-time, compressible or expandable substrate or lattice upon which physical or material reality, from atomic nuclei to black holes, exists or appear to exist. Moreover, it's gradually being discovered that Soliton waves play an important role in the living state as well. In fact, because of their strange transmaterial nature, they may be that more pervasive, fundamental element that characterizes memory and consciousness. Now, how can it have such a property? If you drop a pebble in the water, what happens? You see a ring of waves that go out from the center of that pebble. But then what happens? At some point in time, they all disperse, they dissipate, they die, they disappear. But to give you an idea of what a soliton is like, if you drop the same pebble in the water and just imagine that the wave, that little circular interference pattern just stays there literally forever, that it doesn't go anywhere, that it can't be destroyed. And that's one of their unique properties, in that they maintain their structural symmetry and dynamic properties without dissipation over an appreciable space-time interval. They are remarkably elastic. Individual solitons may collide, in essence interpenetrate each other without mutual destruction, and then reconfigure themselves with the same form. Next slide, please. Why don't you skip the next two, and because I'm running out of time. Yeah, skip that and go to yeah, that's upside down. Okay, start at the top, right there. Okay, the top you have, this is a computer representation of a soliton wave. You see the two of them moving together. Okay, then the next slide, you see them coming together. The third one, you see them merge. The next one, you see them come apart. And now you see them further apart and separated, and the last move the last one up. And now you see that they're the same, just like they were in the beginning. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is another type of solitonic interaction. Here, the difference will be immediately recognized. Here you see two solitons coming together. The next slide, you see them merge. The next slide, you see them sort of separate. The next one, you see them come back together again. Then you see them move out. And now you see them stable. And that's called a bound state, a bound resonant state. And that these two that came together are happily married forever. And that leads, there's a whole bunch of properties, but I don't have the time to deal with that. Now, let me have the next slide. This is probably hard to see. But anyway, this is a representation of the transformation of information in our nervous system. How we take information in, and then we get a mapping of this information, a transformation of information from sensory space, that is how our senses pick up everything, to neural space, because you have to represent sensory space in neural space. And the only way you can do that, it has to be done transphysically. It can't be done physically, because nothing physical is eternal. Eventually it dissipates. The stomachs that you have today is a brand new stomach. You didn't have the same stomach you have today 10 years ago. So our bodies are constantly turning over. And so they want to say that memory is stored in the brain. It's not. They want to say that memory is stored from molecular turnover. It's not, because molecules turn over so fast, they can't maintain the state. There has to be some identifiable frequency in which you can recall an event that happened 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And molecular turnover would not allow that to happen, because the molecules dissipate and recombine. So with that last slide that I showed you in that Soliton bound state, that would be the resonant state for a particular event that took place. And you recall that event because it has a certain time signature. It has a certain serial number. But the serial number is transphysical. It's not physical. And this is very important, because we're dealing with ourselves when we talk about transphysical, which simply means our thoughts, emotions, feelings. Because you can't register them, you can't measure them. But you do feel, you do interact. So that's something that's physical. Now, solitons, as transphysical, spatially, and temporally stable objects, not only act as carriers of both internal quantum energy, such as weak and strong nuclear forces, but also classical kinetic energy, momentum, charge, spin, mass, and for living things, information. And when the information is quantized, what we have is a physical representation of that state. So everything that we see, in effect, is a certain type of soliton, including our bodies. You see what I'm trying to say? Yeah. Western physicists are trying to unify physical laws, the four forces: electromagnetism, the weak force, the strong nuclear force, and gravity. Well, with soliton theory, they're already unified to begin with. And a few of them are beginning to see this now, but not quite in the terms as I see it, because I've taken it much further than they've taken it. Next slide, please. Can you see that? Yeah. Can you read it? No, it's kind of hard to read. Okay. Well, that's simply. I apologize for that. But that simply is showing how we code information and use information. Because within our mind, there's three fundamentally different types of internal code or representation taking place simultaneously. Mental images for coding spatial relationships, abstract propositions for encoding the meaning, and polyrhythmic encoding of the order of the items in a sequence that's both linear and nonlinear. You know, this is how we encode information and use it. Now, the thing I wanted to show you, that other one, was how the neuromelanin nerve tract fits into that. But I have to move on. This slide here is just representing functional states. That a functional state of the mind is related to the quality and type of cognition, attention, learning, decision-making, and recall of information. And where down there at the bottom you see something that says clock, a little box that says clock. Well, that clock is a number of multi-sensory pigmented cells that are in a lot of strategic sections of the brain, which integrate all this sensory information. So the neuromelanin nerve tract is very important in the integration of sensory information, external sensory information and internal sensory information. Because in order to exist, we have to have that balance between the two. There's a constant shifting and moving back and forth between these two different sets of information. Next slide. This simply is giving you some idea of the transformation from a sensory space-time to a neural space-time. And the image that you have at the bottom is just a pattern of dots. But we can focus on that pattern of dots and see a series of squares. But how do we see that series of squares? How is that represented? That's represented by selective features that we have cells within our bodies that just look for special features or novelty. We remember novel things. We remember novel sounds. And this transformation into memory is transphysical, which is that top state is showing, that soliton wave bound state that I showed you earlier, where the two solitons came together and they end up being one. Well, that happens not just for two, but for millions. Okay? Next slide, please. Now, how can we use this information? You know, it's no good if it's just theory. Am I right? You know, we got to be able to apply this information. So, we have to understand that real time perception, just perception period, extends slightly into the past and slightly into the future. I don't know if you can see that up there. But that center black rectangle represents the now. Now I'm going to tell you what that now means. We have to understand that we construct reality. All the time we're constructing reality. This light in this room, it looks like it's a continuous wave. You know, when we go to a movie, it looks like a continuous set of images, but we know that it's actually a sequence of images that are being rotated, that are being moved at a certain rhythm. So it gives us the illusion that things are moving. And this illusion is how we perceive and construct reality. Because reality is no more than from 0 to 700 milliseconds, or 7/10 of a second. This is the eternal now. Right there. That is the eternal now. That doesn't make sense. Do you understand what I'm saying here? Okay. Now, what I'm saying is that we look at things like this, or classical physics will talk about waves, but actually things are really like this.
Yeah.
And we experience each of these little bits as the right now.
Right.
Each one of these is the right now, the eternal now. Each one of those little bits of information, reconstruction. But it's reconstructed so it looks like this black line, this continuous wave, or the straight line. But this is what we do all the time. So, and by the way, that little black rectangle really is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus acts as a filter, okay, for all this multi-sensory information. And then our neuromelanin nerve tract decides what gets through and what doesn't get through. It is the gatekeeper. So when you look at comedic lifeways, when they talk about going into the netherworld, you're talking about, you know, those various doors that are opened up and the different states that one enters in as those doors are opened up, or you're talking about being able to control how information reaches one's consciousness via the neuromelanin nerve tract. That it is the gatekeeper to all these states of consciousness that people experience. As one's consciousness becomes more and more black self-centered, one will enhance the clarity of all three types of intuitive knowing. Okay? Rational intuition. You know, we tend to think intuition is just intuition, but there's different kinds of intuition. Rational intuition, which simply means inferred pattern detection and image formation. That you infer something. You don't actually really feel it, but you infer that it's there. Then you have holistic intuition, and that is the apprehension of the totality of a situation. Okay? Then finally you have quantum intuition. That simply means forecasting, creating desired futures via expanded awareness. We have to deal with all these different states. Now, it just so happens, to move that slide up, please. Can you move it up higher so people in the back can see that? Okay, here we see our eye. Now you have to go back, just visualize that previous image that I had of the eye going directly to the pineal gland. Okay, because you have to see the whole thing. Okay, the first slide, one of the first slides that I showed, could you find that? It's about the third one.
Number 3?
Yeah, number 3. Which said eye to third eye. Right. Okay. Okay, now you can put the other one back. Our brain's frontal lobes are known to have several amazing functions: planning, strategizing, anticipating the future. There's such thing as called an expectancy wave. That is a special spike train that anticipates the future. Individual cells in it look forward or backward in time. One group of cells encodes a temporary memory of recent events. A second group modifies activity based on experience and prepares for coming events. Communication between both groups allow for a rapid assessment of possible futures. Okay, this is a natural thing. That's why our ancestors could project their consciousness into the future. That's why Kemetic civilization lasted so long, because they projected what they wanted the future to be. And that's something that we can do too. All we have to do is what? Do it. Okay? We project in the future what we want the future to be. Okay, next slide. Now, how do we do that? Okay, here, that arrow at my right is showing emotional intensity. And then we have time, then we have space. So yeah, it's really multi-dimensional. And then you see something that says individual's world. Well, that's you, that's me. With the right amount of feeling, then we can open those gates to the neuromelanin nerve tract and enter in various consciousness states. Now that is ritually done in many religious traditions via music. And there are some musicians who understand right here in the United States who understand that whole phenomenology of knowing which notes to play, which rhythms to play, so forth and so on. The musicians are in control. If you look at any trance dance, the musicians can't go into trance. because they're the ones that's facilitating the trance, controlling it, inducing it, keeping it going, and then bringing people out. Just that we've been entranced by a different set of kind of rhythms, and different types of sounds. But with the knowledge of how we can affect consciousness states via opening the gates to the neuromelanin nerve tract, well, then we can move forward. A couple other little tidbits that I want to share with you. I think it's important to throw these out because I can relate this whole Soliton thing to reincarnation or resurrection. You know, that you have a choice, and I'll do this tomorrow, that people in Kemet had a choice. Either if you wanted to reincarnate, fine. If you didn't, that's fine too. Because when you look at the two shafts on Khufu's pyramid, one is pointing to Orion, the belt of Orion, which is Sirius, Asaru, which means the returning eternally, and other is dealing with the circumpolar stars, which is eternity in itself. So we can talk about that and talk about a lot of other things. But a couple little tidbits that I recently found out I want to share with you. And that is first, there was an invention recently of a special ointment that someone who is European can rub it on at night, and in the morning wake up with a beautiful tan. That's right, and they're getting ready to begin human testing now. So I just want to throw that out to you, that there's a lot of things happening. But then there's something else that's happening which has the European community in a frenzy, and that is the opening of the ozone layer in the Antarctic and the Arctic. Okay, and that's allowing a lot more ultraviolet light to come through. Now, what does all this mean? You know, I want you to understand this. Now, in contemporary genetic literature, we hear the terms dominant and recessive, that there's no way for a person of European ancestry who is white, that is devoid, depigmatized, can ever have a child that has any skin color. Okay, that's no longer true. Okay, that's no longer true. Because you have to ask yourself, how did the zebra get its stripes? You know, I talked about that the other day. I gave a little story about that, how the zebra got its stripes and the giraffe got its long neck. It goes back to what I said earlier about information, that chaos of things, that things are not as ordered and as regular as they seem, that sometimes you can have spikes come through that introduce disorder. One such spike came through, and that allowed for the alteration of pigmentation in certain animals. Okay, another spike came through that if you just happen to be in a certain geographical location, that allowed for total depigmentation, skin-wise anyway. But some more spikes are coming that's going to reverse that process. So at some point in the future, maybe 100 years, maybe 1,000 years, there'll be very few white people left on the planet. And it has in skin color now. There'll still be white minds, maybe. But we have to start looking at things, that things are not as stable and as regular as we would like them to be, that there's constant transformation. Now I have the three slides. I just got 3 slides and I'm going to be finished. From the projector. Another thing about neuromelanin, that neuromelanin modulates the on-off state of the entire nervous system through soliton phonon production in one direction, changing its electrical properties such as conductivity. I talked about that superconductivity earlier, semiconductor properties, and in the reverse direction, vibrational energy, which influences the permeability of axon membranes. So there's just so much that I could talk about, but that's upside down. Anyway, that slide is showing why is Kemet so important. Okay, this is an infrared photo from the orbiting infrared observatory. And if you look at it, does anyone know what that looks like? Or what? It looks, that is a lotus. That's a lotus flower. So the entire Nile Valley is a lotus flower. And we all know that lotuses symbolize a high state of consciousness, the highest state of consciousness available to human beings. That's what it symbolizes. You can turn the lights down a little bit so everyone can see it a little better. But we look and we see at the first cataract, that's where the leaves of the Kemetic lotus flower would fall out. And the roots go all the way down to the Great Lakes. And so it's showing this, that the slide doesn't show it, but it's showing that from the Great Lakes, from the mountains of the moon, this birth of human consciousness. And it just had to happen there rather than anywhere else. Okay, the next slide. Now this next one is very interesting. That's upside down too. This one. That's kind of hard to see, but let me just explain what that is and why we have to deal with this trans-physical state of consciousness. This slide, and many of you who are going to Kemet, Dr. Ben or some of the other people will be happy to take you there. This is in Karnak, and this is called the birth chamber room. And it's on the second floor in the temple, nearby from the high room of the sun. And what's on here is very hard to see here, but we see Isis and Nephthys sitting on a chair at the bottom. Then you have the symbol for heaven above their heads, which is showing that this marriage, this birth, is made in heaven, a high spiritual state. And you see some very unusual poses of Khnum. Well, I can't see it myself. But anyway, you see some very unusual poses of the hands. That there's a transfer of energy, but that's taking place here. Now, what's so significant about this, and I felt that it was my duty to share this with you, is that we're talking about divine birth. How you create kings and queens. First, you have to have a trans-physical conception. And this is what they dealt with all the time. They exchanged energy between themselves before actual physical sex. They had trans-physical copulation, dealing with mental imagery to project what they wanted the child to be before it was born. Now, I felt I wanted to share this with you because this is what we have to get to our kids. You know, we have to focus on this higher level of consciousness of being. And that's what this represents. The last slide. This last slide is very significant also because we've heard so many stories of how our great foreparents constructed the pyramids, at least the early ones anyway. And I happened to find this in a rather obscure Egyptological journal at the University of Chicago. And at least this gives us some idea that they in fact say at least how they transported the stones. And what we see, the inscription reads, moving a colossus. So the question you have to ask, how can 3 men lift, carry, transport a block of limestone that weighs a minimum of 3,000 pounds? Okay, they understood those keys, those gates that they had to open up to their higher dimensional selves. They understood breath, they understood sound, they understood rhythm, they understood light at levels more profound than we understand today. But there are some of us who are naturally learning some of these things. If you ever look at Michael Jordan, what's his nickname? Air Jordan. I've seen tapes where the man jumps in the air, comes down, and then goes back up and gets 2 points. Now, how can you be in the air, come down in the air, and then go back up in the air? You know, that is dealing with this transphysical state of consciousness. Wiley Brooks, a puny little man that used to live in Los Angeles, now lives in Denver, weighs 150 pounds. They had him on TV pressing 1,150 pounds. And the only thing he says he does is drink orange juice and get sunlight and breathe. That's what he said. They have found certain keys to open up some gates to our neuromelanin nerve tract. That blackness that I talked about at the beginning. You can turn the lights on. I'm going to close with another small poem that I wrote some years ago. Each of our lives has its own rhythm, moving through time and space at its own pace, standing still for no one, moving towards its perfection and realization. Yet we worry because so many of our minds look like the Sahara, a desert of self-ignorance, our wisdom and our great civilizations destroyed. But today, many people are having inner visions, but are unclear on their life's mission. Some are hearing inner voices, some are afraid to stand and make the right choices. Everybody wants to know what's going on. Well, a battle is raging for the prize of all time, the control of our spirit, heart, and mind. The forces of evil versus the forces of good. This is the great conflict our ancestors understood. Even though the adversary is powerful and strong, people don't get weary, for his time is almost gone, gone, gone. Recall the wisdom of Minister Malcolm X. He took the chains off our brains and broke their hips. Now we have the power to command respect. For within us, we do contain more than just elements of earth, wind, fire, and rain. We existed before space and time. Our essence extends within and beyond matter and mind. Someday, we soon will discover we are divine. Thank you very much.